Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into what is honestly a fascinating masterclass on the human body's ultimate security force, the immune system. We're going to look at how allergies, autoimmunity, and even sepsis, well, they're actually just different ways that the exact same protective machinery goes awry. Normally, we think of these as totally separate medical conditions, right? But by the end of our time together, you're going to see them as interconnected parts of a single spectrum. It's a brilliantly designed system, right? Up until it isn't.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here are our 4 stops for today. First up, the 2-tier defense. Then, the 4 hypersensitivity types. Third, autoimmunity, or the friendly fire. And finally, the sepsis continuum. This is going to give us a really clear mental map.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the 2-tier defense. So before we can understand how things go wrong, we really have to understand our baseline heroes, right? You essentially have 2 distinct levels of defense. First, there's innate immunity. You are born with this. In fact, it's so ancient, we actually share parts of this exact same system with fruit flies. It's incredibly fast, totally nonspecific, and it acts as your absolute first line of defense. Think physical barriers like your skin and cellular defenders like neutrophils and macrophages. It doesn't learn, it just attacks any threat the exact same way every single time. Then you have adaptive immunity. Now this one is slower to activate initially, but it is highly specific and critically, it has a memory. It relies on lymphocytes, specifically your B cells and T cells. Because this adaptive system creates memory cells, a second exposure to a threat, it results in a way faster and stronger response. And actually, that adaptive memory is the entire physiological principle behind how vaccines work.
Now, within that adaptive system, your B cells create antibodies. Those are custom-built proteins for specific antigens, which we call humoral immunity. But let's focus heavily on the T cells for a second. Specifically, the helper T cells, or CD4 cells. These guys act as the immune system's absolute command center. They don't just go out and attack, they coordinate the body's entire defense response. We do have cytotoxic T cells, or CD8s, that do the direct killing, but the CD4s, they're the generals giving the orders. And honestly, understanding this makes it incredibly clear why a virus like HIV is so uniquely devastating. It specifically targets and disables these CD4 command centers, basically blinding the coordinator of the entire response.
Let's move to Section 2, the 4 hypersensitivity types. Now we're entering the overreaction phase, where these normally amazing protective systems become hyperactive and actually start causing damage. We can methodically break this down into 4 types. Type 1 is your immediate hypersensitivity. Think of your classic allergic reactions, like peanut allergies or a bee sting. IgE antibodies bind to mast cells, and boom, you get an immediate rapid release of histamine. Type 2 is cytotoxic hypersensitivity. This is where antibodies mistakenly attack antigens directly on the surface of our own cells, marking them for destruction. It's exactly what happens in a mismatched blood transfusion. Then there's Type 3, immune complex hypersensitivity. Here, antibodies and antigens bind together, form these little floating complexes, and literally deposit themselves in tissues, often small blood vessels or the kidneys. This triggers severe inflammation, which is actually the mechanism behind lupus nephritis. And then we have Type 4.
Now, what's really interesting here is that massive jump in timing, 24 to 72 hours. So why is this one so slow compared to the others? Well, it's because Type 4, unlike the first 3, doesn't involve antibodies at all. It is entirely T-cell mediated. That means it literally takes time for those cells to ramp up, mobilize, and develop, creating a very specific delayed type reaction. This is exactly what you're seeing when someone gets a positive TB skin test or, that contact dermatitis rash that pops up a couple of days after brushing against poison ivy.
So if you're trying to study this clinical progression, here is your anchor. This is a perfect little mental trick to lock in for long-term retention. Fast equals antibodies. That covers types 1, 2, and 3. They act fast. Slow equals T cells, and that is strictly type 4. Keep that major physiological distinction in mind, and you will absolutely have a solid grasp on how to categorize these reactions.
Moving on to Section 3, Autoimmunity, the friendly fire.
We're now entering the betrayal phase of our narrative. I really want you to think about this question. What happens when the immune system forgets what self looks like? It's a pretty terrifying thought, honestly. When the ability to distinguish self from non-self completely breaks down, the body begins actively attacking its own tissues. Autoimmunity is, at its core, just hypersensitivity turned completely inward. Let's rapidly map out these cellular betrayals in action. In the joints, you have rheumatoid arthritis, where the immune system attacks the synovium, leading to chronic inflammation and eventually severe joint destruction. Over in the pancreas, you have type 1 diabetes. This is a type 4 T-cell-mediated process that directly assassinates your insulin-producing beta cells. And that is exactly why type 1 diabetics require insulin for life, unlike type 2. And then there's lupus, a systemic disease often driven by those type 3 immune complex depositions we talked about. It can affect the skin, joints, kidneys, and even the central nervous system, making it a true multi-system disease.
So, the crucial point to remember here is this. Autoimmune disease isn't the immune system failing to work. It's the immune system working way too well, just against the wrong target. Reframing it this way kind of changes everything about how we understand these conditions, doesn't it? It perfectly explains why medical treatments for autoimmune diseases usually focus on carefully suppressing immune activity rather than trying to, boost the immune system. The system is already too active, it just has the wrong coordinates.
All right, Section 4, the sepsis continuum.
This brings us to the climax of the explainer. Let's trace how systemic inflammation goes from a helpful, localized defense to a life-threatening body-wide spiral, step by step. It starts with step 1, a localized infection. The body responds, but sometimes it triggers a body-wide inflammatory response, which brings us to step 2, SIRS, or Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. This is marked by an abnormal temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, and white blood cell count. Now, when that SIRS is driven specifically by an infection and starts causing actual organ dysfunction, we progress to step 3, sepsis. At this point, the immune response, which is supposed to be protective, remember, is now the source of the damage. It causes widespread vasodilation, capillary leak, and impaired tissue perfusion, even in organs totally far away from the original infection site.
And if that cascade isn't rapidly reversed, we enter the final, most dangerous stage on the continuum, septic shock. This is characterized by persistent hypotension, dangerously low blood pressure, that requires vasopressors literally just to keep it up. And that's coupled with elevated lactate levels, which indicates the cells are starving for oxygen, also known as cellular hypoxia. At this stage, even if you are pumping the body with adequate fluids, the vascular system simply cannot maintain pressure, because the immune-driven inflammation has caused the blood vessels to basically lose all their tone.
Which leaves us to this profound clinical realization. Sepsis is no longer really about the bacteria at this stage. It's about your own immune and inflammatory response spiraling completely out of control. It brings our entire narrative full circle. The very defense mechanism designed to save you has now become the weapon causing the damage. And this is exactly why, in the clinical setting, early recognition and rapid intervention are so heavily emphasized. Literally every single hour of delayed treatment measurably increases a patient's mortality.
As we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Now that you've seen how a protective system can become the ultimate threat, how does this change the way you view a simple infection? It really highlights the delicate, incredible balance of the pathophysiology that's keeping us alive every single day. I really hope this mental map of the immune system, hypersensitivity, autoimmunity, and sepsis helps these concepts click together for you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I invite you to keep diving deeper into the fascinating world of the human body with us.